Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Graywall. I want to ask a couple of questions, if I could, more in the investor protection realm. This is a little over the 2-year anniversary of the death of Alex Kearns from Naperville, Illinois. This was the young man who was told by Robinhood that he owed them $730,000, took his life after writing his parents a note saying that he didn't know how someone who only had $5,000 to his name was allowed to trade $730,000 of options. That story was soon eclipsed in the national zeitgeist by the GameStop hearings and getting into where were the incentives within Robinhood. And what emerged on this committee was that Robinhood is really this sort of near perfectly toxic brew of selling only to people where they have payment for order flow contracts, earning their revenue not as a fixed fee on those PFAF contracts, but as a percent of the spread, the bid-ask spread on the back end, and then relying on gamification. And so they just had these incentives to find the least sophisticated money in the market, connect them to the most sophisticated players, and then basically use gamification to put the whole thing on steroids. We've had a number of hearings in this committee. We've had a number of bills. I wonder if you could just speak for a moment about what the SEC is doing specifically around gamification and payment for order flow, because as I sit here, we still have not created the regulatory conditions that will protect, a future Alex Kearns from being caught up in this same toxic brew. Can you speak briefly to that?
First, I'm sorry to hear that about the constituent. It's a horrible, horrible story, and I've read about it. Gamification is a huge concern. Last year in the fall, we put out requests for information about gamification, and we're trying to gather more detail from people across the market to see how this practice exists, different perspectives on that practice, and my hope is that will help us inform next steps. From an enforcement perspective, I'm concerned when gamification crosses the line into a recommendation. If it does, and then it has, those folks have to comply with Reg BI. And so I see that as a potential avenue for us to get involved in that space, and we're concerned about it. And gamification also, I think, as we've seen, can be used for manipulative conduct, to further manipulative conduct, and so that's a concern from an enforcement perspective as well.
So you've touched exactly on my follow-up, and I mean, this format is horrible because we want to play gotcha and get zingers on the record, but at least as I sit there from my perspective, I have no idea how you could honestly say you were looking out for the best interests of your customers if you are using gamification to recommend stocks, and if you are only relying on payment for order flow off-takers, right? I mean, by definition, you are not looking. And can you say anything affirmatively that we know this? And it hurts me because we're 2 years in, and what seems to be obvious, we're still waiting for a hearing and a ruling. And meanwhile, the companies like Robinhood continue to make a lot of money from what seems to be not looking after their investors' best interests.
So again, I can't talk about specific entities or individuals or firms that we may or may not be looking at. I could tell you that digital engagement practices more broadly are a concern for the chair. We've started this information gathering last fall on this issue. Perhaps that will inform future rulemaking. I've shared with you how I think it impacts enforcement. It's something that we're very concerned about, particularly with Reg BI, how it intersects and could constitute a recommendation. And then on the manipulation side, how it could be used in furtherance of manipulative conduct. And it could have horrific consequences as well, as we've seen in the case that you highlighted.
I know we've only got 50 seconds left here, but a lot of those same factors seem to be, I mean, the crypto rise and crash looks an awful lot like the meme stock rise and crash. It's driven by a lot of the same zeitgeist. It again looks like the unsophisticated players taking charge. Leaving aside that you can't tell us exactly what you're doing on the gamification and PFOF issue, is crypto the same way, or are we going to have to at some point clarify whether you or the CFTC has authority over crypto before we can make sure that we're protecting those investors there?
We're using, Congressman, our authorities to investigate and bring actions against those who violate our laws, whether they be the anti-fraud provisions or other aspects of the securities laws.
Are you satisfied you have the resources to do that?
Well, I could always use more resources, but we're making the best with the additional 20 slots, and I'm hopeful to get the 125 additional slots that we've asked for.
Okay, yield back, thank you.
Thank you. Now recognize the gentleman, but before I do,